Danny from projectmanaverse.com, and in this video I'm going to share 5 common mistakes when it comes to project scope. So let's jump straight in. First of all, what is project scope? Project scope is basically a description of what your project is going to deliver. It's usually quite summarized, it's quite high level, but you need something to document what your project is all about and what your project is going to be doing, and that's what the scope is. And what it does is it sets a nice boundary and framework around your project, so you know what you're doing and what you're not doing, and that is basically what your project scope is. Now, project scope is really important for a project manager, and it's important you understand these common mistakes, because the project scope is the starting place for everything else in your project. From your project scope, you can create your project requirements. From your requirements, you can create your design, and then from your design, you create your testing plan and your test scripts, and then you build the thing. So that's why it's so important, because if you get this scope wrong and it's not quite right, or you've got flaws in it, that can have like a chain reaction effect to all those other downstream deliverables on your project, and ultimately it could mean that your build is not quite right and your product is not quite right for your customers. So it's important you understand these common mistakes. So with that being said, let's jump into the 5 common mistakes. So common mistake number 1 is that project managers don't actually use a scope document. They don't clearly define the scope at the start of the project and get it all documented. Now that can lead to bad things for many reasons. Number 1, it just means that there isn't clarity in your project. You want things to be clear, and you want to make sure that all the stakeholders around your business, everyone that's looking in on your project, understands what your project is all about. And there's no vagueness or uncertainty when people are talking about your project, especially like these senior leaders in various business areas. You don't want your project to have the bad reputation and people don't really understand what you're doing or why you're doing it. If you have a clear project scope, then that prevents that from happening. So all your stakeholders are clear, and it means your project is well known and people really understand what you're doing. Also, without the project scope documented, it can lead to things like scope creep. And scope creep is when work keeps being added to your project. You keep being asked to do more things, and you might be thinking, well, hold on, we didn't really sign up for this. But if you don't have that scope document to begin with, then you don't really have a leg to stand on. So you need to make sure you have a scope document to make everyone clear about what you're doing, and to try and avoid that scope creep later on down the line, so people keep asking for more things out of your project that you don't have the resources to deliver. Okay, so that's common mistake number 1. Common mistake number 2 is that in the scope document, let's say you do actually use one, people don't always call out the key things that are not in scope or key things that are out of scope. Now that's quite important as well. Obviously you want to put in what your project is doing, but you really want to call out in a out of scope section exactly what you're not doing. And obviously you can't list everything in there, because that list would go on forever. But there are some key things that people might expect you to be doing that you're not going to do. And if that is the case, you want to be calling those out in your out of scope section. So if you have any initial conversations about scope with your stakeholders and they're asking you, oh, are you going to be doing this? If you are not going to be doing it, make sure you capture that as one of the items for your out of scope section. So things like training, for example, that's a common one. You might be all about the IT project, upgrading the software or building the new software or doing the database migration, but there might be some user impact to that. There might need a little bit of training, but maybe that's not in your remit to deliver. So if that's the case, you want to make sure that's in your out of scope section. Also, things like decommissioning is a common one I see missed out quite a lot. So you could be creating some new software or new infrastructure, migrating a database. So that's your scope, but you're not on the hook for actually decommissioning the old infrastructure and the old system. So and that can be quite expensive and time consuming. So if you're not supposed to be doing that, make sure that's clearly called out in your out of scope section. So that's common mistake number 2. Common mistake number 3 is that the scope wasn't approved by all the appropriate stakeholders. That's really, really key. So number 1, you need to make sure you've got all the key stakeholders identified, and you can do that at the start of your project with all your team members. Really look at the IT landscape of all the systems, upstream and downstream of the thing that you're doing, and then think about, right, who are the key stakeholders that could have this project could impact. Make sure you identify all of them, get advice from other people, get their opinion too, and just make sure they're included in that scope process, either in just the review and sign off, or also in the contribution of creating that scope in the first place. You want to make sure all those stakeholders are captured. That way you can't be caught out later on down the line if something is missed, or they want to add something, or they think you're doing something that shouldn't be done. That way you can cover yourself and make sure you've got the right governance in place by ensuring all those key stakeholders, the correct appropriate stakeholders, were included when you actually created that scope document. So that's common mistake number 3. Common mistake number 4 is that governance is not followed when changing the scope. Now, sometimes scope will need to change on a project. Sometimes you'll need to do some additional stuff, or you need to de-scope some things and take it out because you can't deliver them. It's not possible, or you don't have the funding or the resources to do it. That can happen. But if you're going to change the scope in any way, make sure you're going through the correct governance and you're doing it properly. And the proper way to do it is to go through a change request process. And that will be done through your formal governance channels, be it a steering group or some kind of change control forum, where you raise an official change request to change the scope. That change request is then impact assessed by all the different areas, because you want to understand, if we do this change, what's it going to be? What's the cost to the project in terms of money? What's the cost in terms of time? But also, what's the impact to some other areas? What's the impact to other parts of the build you've already done? What's the impact to some downstream departments or systems? You need to consider all those things before you change a scope. And once that's all been done, then it can be approved formally. It's all documented, so no one can come down the line later on and say, why did you change the scope? And you just don't lose track of things. It's all nicely documented and you've got yourself covered. So that's common mistake number 4. The last one, common mistake number 5, is that you don't review your scope document enough with your team. Now, the scope document, especially the scope on a page, I like to produce a summarized version of the scope just on one PowerPoint slide, nice and visual, in a little picture in terms of exactly what the project is doing. Because just by doing that one simple tool and sharing it with your team every week, it provides a lot of clarity to your team members. Because if you're not clear on what you're delivering, and this happens a lot, the scope isn't clear, it's a bit foggy and hazy, then that can demotivate your team, and it means they start procrastinating with what they should be doing, and you don't have the focus and productivity you should be getting from your team. But if everyone is crystal laser-like focused on what the scope is, and you can achieve that by reviewing your scope on a page in your project working group with your team every week, that really does boost productivity, because everyone's crystal clear on what they're delivering. There's no excuse for procrastination. We all know what we're doing, and you've got a plan to deliver it. I always say that the prime directive of a project manager is to bring order from chaos and to bring clarity from the nebulae. Those two things. And what the scope document does, it really does bring clarity from the nebulae, because change by its nature is very foggy. It can be very vague, especially these IT projects. It's hard to crystallize and visualize what you're doing. But with that scope document on a page, you can really do that. Okay, so that was common mistake number 5. So I'll do a quick recap and then we'll call it a day. So common mistake number 1 is that people just don't use the scope document. They don't document it in the first place. That's a big no-no. Make sure you're documenting the scope in some shape or form. Common mistake number 2 is you're not calling out the things or specifying the things that are out of scope. So it's not just what's in scope. What are the key things that are out of scope for your project, to make sure you're covering yourself, so no one later on down the line says, well, hold on, why aren't you doing this? And you can say, well, it's clearly marked out of scope and you signed off the document. Okay, common mistake number 3 is that the scope wasn't approved by all the appropriate stakeholders. So make sure you identify all the stakeholders at the start, make sure you engage them in the process of creating that scope document, and then make sure they are involved in the sign-off process. If they say that they shouldn't be signing off the scope and it's nothing to do with them, that's fine, but just make sure you get that in writing so you can use it later on if they change their mind and suddenly want to have an opinion on your project. Common mistake number 4, governance is not followed when changing the scope. So make sure you go through that formal change request process if you want to change anything, either to de-scope something or add scope in. And then common mistake number 5, it's not reviewed enough with your team. So review your scope on a page. You could do the whole document if you want to, but the scope on a page is nice and clean. Get a nice diagram in there that everyone in your team is laser focused on what they should be delivering, and there's no excuse for procrastination, and your team will be more productive. Okay, that's the video. Hope you enjoyed it. Give it a thumbs up if you did, and if you want to see more videos like this one, hit the subscribe button, and until tomorrow, please take care.